Before our speakers begin, I would like to note a few logistics. All attendees are currently in listen-only mode. Following our speakers' remarks, we will open the webinar up to questions. Throughout the presentations, please type your question into the chat box, which we will work to address during the Q&A period. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to registrants after the webinar. Now, I would like to turn it over to Naomi Baum for opening remarks.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Naomi Baum, the Chief Operating Officer of the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, or ACEEE. We are a nonprofit research and advocacy organization which works to advance energy efficiency policies, programs, technologies, investments, and behaviors. To learn more about our work, check out our website at aceeee.org. Now, as part of my role here, I oversee 2 of our research programs, including our Behavior and Human Dimensions research program. And for the last few years, I've also served as one of the co-chairs for the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference, or BECC. BECC is a unique conference in that it brings together individuals who don't always have the opportunity to share knowledge: researchers, policymakers, utility program implementers, and businesses focused on energy and behavior to achieve actionable climate solutions. BECC is in its 12th year and is co-convened by UC Berkeley, Stanford University, and ACEEE. Since its inception, we have helped spark the creation of companion conferences in Europe and Japan, and this year we have started a webinar series to present research on energy and behavior throughout the year. Today, we present the second webinar in our series. Now, we'd love to see you at this year's BECC conference, which is taking place in Sacramento, California, from November 17th to the 20th. The early bird registration deadline is May 15th, so register soon before prices go up. Today's webinar is on an interesting report ACEEE released last week on how to design and present persuasive home energy assessment reports. Our speakers will be Dr. Reuben Sussman, who led the project, as well as Dr. Beth Carlin, Harrison Grubbs, and Greg Thomas, and each will be introduced in turn during the webinar. And now I'd like to turn things over to Reuben Sussman, who will begin the webinar.
Thanks, Naomi. My name is Dr. Sussman, and I spearheaded this project after the audit, which is about improving residential energy efficiency assessment reports. The report itself was released last week, and you can get the report or a nifty 2-page fact sheet off the link that you see on your screen. We'll also be recording this webinar, and you can get that in the next day or 2 off our YouTube page. And of course, if you want to register for BECC or you want more information, the BECC conference website is there, or you can just Google BECC conference. So today we'll talk about not home energy assessments per se, but the reports that are generated and presented to the homeowners after the assessment is completed. So after this year-long project of looking at reports, talking to people who got them, we have a few key recommendations. I'm going to skip straight to the end right now, so you don't need to watch the whole presentation if you don't want to. Here's the 6 areas of recommendations that we have. Personalization, language, behavioral insights, design, information placement within the report, and assessment itself, and the presentation of the results. So let me go into a little bit more detail of each of these. First, personalization. We found it important for the assessors to custom tailor the content of the report, as well as the prioritized recommendations they give to homeowners, and the narrative summaries that they create. So that means using, whenever possible, avoiding boilerplate language and instead using language that's specific to that homeowner. Not just why a leaky house is bad in general, but why this particular house could benefit from being less leaky. Also, the prioritized recommendations should be based on the customer's specific needs. So maybe those are financial, but maybe in some cases they're health or environmental or otherwise. And the narrative summary is a very specific personal description of what the problems in the homes were and the recommendations. All these things together create a feeling of honesty and credibility and trustworthiness that makes the reports more persuasive. Keep the language clear and simple. Harrison's going to talk a little bit more about this, but we found that our reports were generally written at a rather high level, and most assessors could do better by avoiding jargon and acronyms and generally simplifying language. Behavioral insights. Beth Carlin's going to talk about this. This is more about applying what we know from social science and psychology research to improve these reports, using social comparisons, framing the benefits as not just financial, but maybe non-financial as well, removing barriers by giving the information that's required, and using vivid language to really bring the reports to life, and other things that Beth will be talking about when she talks about her section later. Design. Use a consistent structure throughout the report. Use high-quality photos with explanations of those photos. And when possible, use tables and graphs. We found that tables draw and hold attention quite well, but when they're actually confusing or when the graphs don't simplify the information well, it makes things worse. And Harrison's going to talk a little bit about design and photos, etc. Information placement. So if you think of your report as a mullet, you want to put the information that's more important at the beginning of the report with, with additional details in the back of the report. So what we mean to say is, in the first 4 or 5 pages, that's when the homeowner makes their key decisions, and many don't read beyond that. However, for some homeowners that want additional information or that need to provide the information to the contractors, additional details in the back or in an appendix are also very helpful. And finally, the assessment itself and the presentation of the report. Make sure both of these pieces are personally engaging and accessible. Walk the homeowner through the home. Take pictures of their home and show it to them. Explain as you're going what you're looking for and what you found. And then when you create the report, don't just deliver it by email or by mail. Make sure you not hand deliver, but go over in person the results of the report. And that will really make it more persuasive and make the chances of action higher. All right, so now let's get into the project itself and what we did. There was 4 pieces to this project. Now that you've heard the results, I can get into a little bit more meat of what we did and what we found. The first piece was the content analysis. Here we collected as many reports as we could. In the end, we got 68 of them. We narrowed it down to 45 unique ones, and we coded 65 elements of each report, including the readability scores. Next, we turned over 42 of those 45 unique reports to experts. So each report was reviewed by a behavioral scientist, a graphic designer, and a home energy assessor, and they gave us their rundown of what they thought of them. In total, each one of our graphic designers, behavioral scientists, and assessors looked at about 7 or 8 reports each. Then we had an eye tracking study. We looked at the 3 of the reports that were rated rather highly. We made 5-page versions of those and sent them for an eye tracking study to see what captures attention best and what holds attention. And finally, we did a separate customer survey. So we actually asked customers that received home energy assessments what they did with those assessments, how they liked them, and how they could be improved. So these are people from New York State and Northern Illinois, a total of over 600 people. All right, so our other panelists are going to talk about most of the other aspects of this report, but I just wanted to touch on one piece that I thought was interesting, and that was the eye tracking study. For the eye tracking study, we worked with a company called IC that has proprietary software that allows you to send a visual stimulus to a group of people anywhere in the world. And while those group of people are reading or looking at your stimulus, they can give permission for you to track their eye movements using their webcam. And what this allows you to do is get a nationally representative sample of US homeowners in this case, and see what they look at while they're reading the reports. So this is just one insight from this eye tracking study that we thought was interesting. It has to do with scan path. Scan path is what people look at in which order. And so we found very consistently that people looked at the top, from the top to the bottom of each page, and from the start to the end of each report. And that might not seem surprising, but what it means is that regardless of how interesting or important the information on the reports were, the structure of the report really dictated what people saw and what people skipped. So the stuff at the top and the beginning was more likely to be viewed. We also found from the experts at IC pointed out to us that smooth and simple pattern of eye gaze resulted in less skipping of sections. So let's see what this actually looked like. This is a sample report we actually examined. As you can see, there's some images and text at the top, as well as a graph. I'm sorry that the writing didn't come out super clear. But on the right, you can see the scan path. And as you can see, this follows a nice pattern of starting in the top third of the page and slowly going down to the bottom, with the areas that are green or white being least likely to be viewed, and the bottom is less likely to be viewed. Here's another page of report, also a good report. This one, as you can see, starts in the top and then makes its way, the eye gaze starts at the top and makes its way down to the bottom. But here, eye gaze also bounces around a little bit more. And so we might expect a few more of these sections to be skipped than in the nicer, smooth pattern of viewing. These are just a couple of the insights. To see all of them, I highly recommend downloading and viewing the report that we've created. All right, now I'll get into a little bit more about what you'll hear and see from us in the rest of this webinar. So my name is Dr. Reuven Sussman. I'm here at ACEEE in Washington, D.C. I run the Behavior and Human Dimensions program. I also co-chair the BECC conference. And my background is in social and environmental psychology. Dr. Beth Carlin, who you'll hear from next, founded and runs the Sea Change Institute. She has a psychology and behavioral science background as well. And Sea Change takes these psychology and behavioral science principles and applies them to daily challenges to relieve problems of climate change and other social issues. Harrison Grubbs, again, sorry for this picture, lost a little bit of detail there. Harrison's going to speak after Beth, and he works for KSV Marketing as the Director of Strategic Partnerships. He has a background in energy, but also an expertise in graphic design and marketing. He was an expert panelist on our program. Greg Thomas with PSD Consulting is an expert in home energy assessments and the software that's used to generate those reports. He was also an expert panelist for our project. So I'm going to turn it over to Beth to talk about behavioral insights and how they can be used in assessment reports. Beth?
Thank you, Reuven. Yeah, so I'm going to, as Reuven said, be wearing the behavioral science hat and just sharing some thoughts on what the behavioral panel said and how we can leverage insights from specifically psychology and behavioral science to improve these reports. So you can go to the next slide. But first I want to just kind of share why we should be looking at audits and why a behavioral science approach matters. So next. So we know energy advice is everywhere. We see home energy reports. We see energy tips and advice in audit reports on websites all over the place. Utilities, cities are constantly sending information to people, trying to get them to do tiny little things that add up a whole bunch to save energy. Next. And little changes do add up. So we've been doing research going back just under a decade, looking at how small changes from things like changing the header from ceiling fans to use fans more, to an action, to switching a photo without a person to a photo with a person, to changing things like save up to versus cut cost by, have a statistically significant difference on people's intention to take action and their actual action-taking behaviors. This seems strange, but it's true that these subconscious motivators can nudge or move us into doing things. So we believe, you can go to the next one, that this is great. This kind of research that doesn't always get out of the ivory tower, that often psychologists write up in journal articles that are only read by other psychologists, have the potential to have an impact right now, right here within our energy sphere. And so at Sea Change, our goal is to take research out of the lab into the streets as quickly as possible, not only to better understand what's going on in the world, but to improve it. And this project is a perfect example of this. So what I'm sharing right here is a model that our team has developed and is using based on a few different psychological models and theories. We've kind of put together our thoughts on what's needed, or a process in thinking about specifically using information to change behavior. And so looking at this in the first step, if people don't look at something, it's not going to affect them at all, right? These audit reports do not change behavior via osmosis. They have to be seen. So the first step is engage your audience, get them to look at the thing you're trying to get them to look at. That seems like it should go without saying, but we looked at a lot of audit reports. It should not go without saying. They are not all engaging. The next is address relevant barriers. We often think if only they knew, if only they cared. And what we've found in behavioral science is there are a lot of things that people know about and care about and don't do, like sleep, exercise, eating better, right? Like how many of us have wanted to lose the same 10 pounds for over 10 years? So we know that it's not just about throwing information at people. It's about figuring out what are the barriers in terms of information, motivation, and maybe they just don't feel like, or they don't know what to do or feel like they can do something, and then really specifically addressing those barriers. Then once you address those barriers, you get people to want to take action, behavioral intention. And behavioral intention is the #1 predictor of behavior at a correlation of about 40%. So we know that there's a lot of things we want to do and don't do, and that's where these little nudges come in. And nudges are just kind of things like choice architecture or goal setting and commitment that just help push us to do what we already want to do. And then ideally at the end, we get to, of course, with audit reports, one or several actions. So I'm just going to walk through and I'm going to share one tip in each of these steps, and with an example from an audit report. So the first one is engage. We can go to the next, Reuven. And engagement is important. So the first is, so the one I wanted to share is say less to say more. You know, we know that people have busy lives and they may want to look at something and don't. I have so many tabs open on my computer with things I want to read and don't get to. And there's this idea that you have 60 seconds to give somebody. You've heard about the elevator pitch, but the truth is you have about 8 seconds to get somebody's attention enough to decide if they want to give you the extra 52. So we think about, when you go to the next, Reuven, kind of two places you can think about saying less to saying more, right? The first is the report, or the first is actually the header, right? That's the 8 seconds to get them to care about the other 52. And interestingly, like I mentioned before, we've seen differences in things like subject lines and emails and headers. So something that has a verb like sealing air leaks outperforms something that just says air sealing. So think about, how are you pulling someone in with language in that header? And like I said, an action is going to be better than a noun. And then once you get into the content, pull out literally every inessential word. I find that you can rewrite a sentence, and it feels painful and pedantic, but you can rewrite a sentence and just keep pulling out language until it's as clear as possible. And you can often take out 20 to 40% of the words without losing any information. That makes a difference. Next one, addressing relevant barriers. So looking at inform. So inform, we see there's get specific, and we talk about specific facts, but I want to talk about correcting misconceptions. One of the things that we saw done the least, that has the most potential, is not just telling people about what they need to do, but identifying these common kind of old wives' tales or misperceptions about energy behaviors. And research has shown that if you don't address that, if you don't figure out what the elephant in the room and address that, you might not get the behavior regardless of how many facts you put in. So as an example from these, we saw a couple, and just to be clear, I put kind of a green bar over the one that we think is a best practice specifically for this concept. So I'm not, if someone on the call has turned in something in an audit report that I'm kind of highlighting as not a best practice, it's just specifically for this, the point I'm trying to make here. So it's not that the thing on the bottom is an awful message. It actually has some really great things. Wash laundry, it's a very clear verb statement. 90% of energy use, that's a great fact. But the one above, what it does is it addresses a misconception. Hey man, you might think that you need to use hot to get your clothes really clean. That's not true. And identifying and overcoming those is really important, because if somebody hears you and they agree with you, but there's something you're not mentioning that's keeping them from engaging in the behavior, you're not going to get the behavior. So figuring out those and putting in those little misperceptions is important. Next, motivate. Again, we talk about engaging emotions, and Reuven mentioned this, but I'm going to focus today on conveying social norms and how we can do that. So this is a great example of a very common messaging strategy that is sending mixed signals. So this message here says, don't trash California very clearly, but in the image above it, it's giving data, it's kind of giving people the impression that littering is common. Look at cigarette butts are the most commonly littered item. They're everywhere. And social psychologists looked at this, things like these kinds of ads in the 80s and messaging around protecting parks, and found and thought, gosh, if we tell people don't do this, but under our breath we're saying, but everybody does, we're actually attenuating our own effectiveness. And a lot of research found that this was true, and that a message like this one, even though this next, Reuben, sorry, click. This next one, even though it's not designed as well, Harrison's probably going, no, that's ugly. But theoretically, a message saying, take your litter home, other people do, is going to be more effective than one that says, don't litter, even though it's kind of common. And so what we need to do is think about, that's often called social norms. And research even found, you can go to the next one, Reuben. And research even found, one of my favorite studies, somebody saw this, Jess Nolan in her master's thesis, asked people, which of these things would make you most likely to save energy? That it saves money, saves the planet, makes you a good citizen, or that your neighbors are doing it? And when asked, people said, in the order that you see, saving money is the #1 motivator, then saving the planet, then being a good citizen. And I don't care what my neighbors are doing, that wouldn't affect me at all. But what they did was they literally did an experiment where they did door hangers with one of these 4 messages, and guess what? The one on the right was the most effective. People don't think it works, but it's a very powerful motivator. So when we look at the reports, making sure that you're focusing on, so we can go to the next, if we look at a couple examples of reports, making sure that you're not just giving data back, but comparing it. I don't know if $37 a month is a good or a bad energy bill unless you compare it to something, unless you compare it to what I could be spending, what my efficient house would look like, or what other people are doing. And so that can be very effective. Going to the next, empowering. This is really important. Like I said, motivation and information are often relied upon as like the 2 pillars of these types of programs, but empowerment is really important. It's important that people feel like they can do something, and if they do it, it'll make a difference. So when we look at showing, how do we show solutions? There's a theory, and this came out of health behavior, but is being applied to environmental, called protection motivation theory. And what it says is it's not enough for us to perceive a risk or perceive that there's something that might happen, good or bad, if we take action. We actually engage in an appraisal process. And we appraise both the threat, if I don't act, what'll happen, and coping. Can I do something about it? And response is a function of both threat and coping appraisal. So if we look at the next, if we, and think about this with things like energy inefficiency or climate change, if we experience high threat, like I really think there's all these things I can do. This audit report was like, your house is leaking everywhere and it's awful and it's not efficient, but I don't feel high confidence in my ability to respond. I don't end up responding. I end up anxious, like, oh my God, my house, but I don't have the time or the money, or I don't know what to do. If people don't see a problem, of course they're not going to act, but we're very good at focusing on freaking people out and scaring them, and then just leaving them in anxiety, feeling like, gosh, there's so much I could do, but. So when we think about, and we can go to the next, when we think about coping appraisal is a function of 2 things, and this is often referred to in psychology as self-efficacy. And people think of self-efficacy as a single construct, but I think it's really important to note that it's, can I do something, behavioral efficacy, and if I do it, will it matter? And a very strong empowerment message focuses on both. Here's something you can do, and here's the difference it'll make, and we'll help you do it. So looking at this example, and this was one where a lot of reports were doing it right, but not enough, not all, and so it bears mentioning that when you point out a problem, tell people what they can do about it, and if possible, alleviate, make it clear, just call someone, it's easy to do, you can do this in 10 minutes, it's, if it is expensive, it's expensive, but it pays for itself. But really make sure that you're not just pointing out problems, that every time a threat appears, a solution comes along right next to it. last, like I said, that's going to get people, that's going to get you to want, and want and do are not the same. So nudges, this is a lot of this research is some of the most recent in the behavioral sciences. It comes out of the field of behavioral economics and judgment decision making, saying that we can kind of push or nudge people towards doing the right thing. And so there's a lot we can do in terms of choice architecture, in terms of presenting options. I'll get to this slide in just a second. There's a lot we can do in terms of presenting options, giving people, you know, 2 or 3 options, not so many that they're overwhelmed, but not so few that they don't feel agency. And there's a rich body of work on nudges. And I'm going to pull into the one that I think is the oldest, that second one, promote follow through. So there's a lot of stuff in that guided decision making, but promoting follow through is one that's really great. And this has actually been around for about 100 years, since 1905, the earliest research on kind of feedback, commitment, and follow through, that says that, and it's really powerful. If you ask somebody, instead of just saying, here are things you can do, asking them to do it. You know, we literally pledge when we were growing up in school, pledge allegiance to our flag. That actually does something. Even things like asking somebody, instead of a verbal, to write their name on a piece of paper is more effective. They're more likely to follow on a pledge or a commitment if they've written their name. They're most likely if they've signed their name, because signatures have this subconscious effect of a contract. So there's these little things that we can do to seal in, instead of just saying, here's a list of things. Can you take the commitment? Can you pledge? Can you write your name down? What is one thing that you can do? I'm going to go over this report. Write down or circle things you can do. So if we go to this example, now again, I'm not speaking to design, Harrison is. So I presented examples that I thought were conveying behavioral science principles, even if not designed in the best way. But this idea of showing the next steps, and then having these little check boxes on the side and inviting people to check the things that you're interested in doing. And this sounds so subtle and strange, but just having the check boxes instead of just bullet points and asking people to check them increases their likelihood to actually follow through. That checkbox creates commitment consistency. In your brain, you've taken the first step, and the second and third and fifth and 10th become all that much easier. So that's that kind of walked through, and I just tried. There are a lot more things we can do. There are a lot more recommendations, as Ruben said in the report, but really just thinking about what we can learn and the science of how our brains respond when you're thinking about your reports. Each of these little things might increase response rates by 1%, 3%. But if you add them up, you can really, really significantly increase the number of people that are responding and the number of actions each person is taking when they receive these reports. And we know, ending like I begin, these small changes do add up. So with that, I'll pass it on.
Thanks, Beth. So I'm Harrison Grubbs, as Ruben said at the beginning. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at KSV Marketing. Go ahead, Ruben. We are a 40-year-old independent advertising agency, full-service marketing agency focused on the energy industry. So when I approached this project, before we started evaluating these audit reports, there were a couple of things we had to figure out. First is you need to have a clear understanding of what is the goal of the audit, and that's maybe dictated by your program or by your business model, but you need to have a clear understanding of what the goal is. Whether that goal is consumer education, promotion of rebates, contractor specifications, or from my perspective, I'm looking at an audit report as a sales tool. Regardless of what you're trying to sell, we should treat it and we should view it and review it as a sales tool. In addition, from a marketing perspective, it's also really critical that you understand your audience. So we know we want to use this audit report as a sales tool, but we need to know who we're trying to sell to, what their specific needs are, what their level of knowledge is, what their level of prior engagement is, in this case with residential energy efficiency. So it's really important before you launch into an audit report and an audit program that you really understand these parameters at the beginning. Go ahead. So as Ruben said, there was a large panel that reviewed these reports. At the highest level, the feedback we got from the marketing folks on this panel were that they were too text heavy, too long, images weren't relevant to the written content, lack of visuals, poor organization. So what I'm going to try to do is dig into a couple of these and look at it from a marketing perspective and come up with some ideas about how we can make them better. So the first area I'm going to talk about is language level. There are a lot of reports out there, and a lot of people will feel very strongly that audit reports should be written at a 4th grade level or 5th grade level or 6th grade level. I look at it even simpler. And I think the easiest, clearest metric to determine if your language for an audit report is appropriate is if the recipient of that report will be able to explain it to someone else. In most cases, that's the other decision maker in the household. So the auditor is there usually with one decision maker, and then once the auditor leaves, they leave a report in that homeowner's hand, and then that evening over the dinner table, that homeowner is going to try to explain it to the other decision makers. So going into that context and making sure that everything you put out there can easily be explained by someone who is not as knowledgeable as the auditor. So for example, if your audit report has a 3 to 4 page glossary, if your audit report talks about N factors and CFM 50 and natural air changes per hour, that's not terminology that the average homeowner is going to be able to explain to their significant other. That's language that auditors and contractors use, but we need to capture these ideas in terms that a typical customer can understand and can appreciate. Likewise, we need to think about the number of choices we're giving to customers. And Beth, touched on this just a little bit. And I think there are multiple philosophies around, what the right number of choices is. My perspective is pretty simple. The more choices you have, and each choice you add on actually lowers the likelihood of conversion. It gives customers more things to think about. It gives customers more options, more things to say no to, more opportunities to get confusion. So a lot of folks have said, and I've heard this as not as scientific knowledge, but as just general knowledge, is that 5 choices is really the max that a typical customer going through an energy audit can absorb and comprehend and make a reasonable decision. So that doesn't mean that an energy audit should be limited to only exploring 5 measures. It's really a metric of how you package those measures and making the choices valuable. So for example, if you're presenting customers with choices, as these are a couple of examples straight out of the report, if you're presenting customers with an entire section on duct leakage and duct insulation, yet it turns out that customer doesn't even have ductwork in their house, you provide them an option that's just going to confuse them. Likewise, if you're providing them options that actually have negative savings values, that's another way that's just going to confuse the customer. While we know negative savings values probably refer to health and safety issues that are critical, they shouldn't be presented and called out in the same format and in the same way that insulation would, that has a clear annual savings value and a clear value proposition associated with it. Next slide. So there are ways, and here are 2 that I think did a fairly good job. There are ways that we can take multiple measures and package them together. So in these cases, we're really giving the customer, even though we're giving them 5 or 6 different options, we're putting it in front of them as a single choice. We're recommending, our top priority is that you do this package of measures. So we've taken a very complex work scope and several measures and actually consolidated it into one choice for our customer. So my position would be, it'd be better to present them with a few packages of measures as trying to give them the entire comprehensive list of measures and giving them too many choices and too many opportunities to say no. Also on the images, Reuben actually touched on a couple of these points. I think there are a few pretty simple lessons around images. Next slide. I think Reuben said that, making them personable, making them applicable, clearly illustrative, using graphs as images. So to have an exterior photo of the homeowner's house on the front cover automatically makes it applicable and makes it personal. And the vast majority of audit reports we reviewed did include that. Likewise, that little chart at the bottom, sorry, go back one, that little chart at the bottom is a great illustration of how to demonstrate CFM50 and air leakage and potential benefits from air sealing to a customer in very simple terms. You're looking at what your home is compared to a standard, and you see that it's about double. That's much easier than trying to explain to a customer the difference between 1,500 CFM and 3,000 CFM. Go ahead. And then there are also some images that I don't think add a lot of value. For example, stock photos of lighting that show a combination of CFLs and LEDs with a generic recommendation to improve your lighting. Or on the right-hand side of the screen, a few photos that have no context, no caption, but were included in the report. While many of us, from a QA perspective, may need to have documentation of your manometer and manoxer numbers, I would argue that that's information that's not going to benefit the customer. So those photos may need to be taken, may need to be included with the file, but should not be part of the core sales presentation that you're giving to these consumers. And likewise, a generic energy graph that shows what a typical house or how a typical house performs, I would also say doesn't add much value, simply because it gives customers the easy opportunity to say, well, my house isn't typical. So next. And Beth alluded to this as well. Depending on the program, depending on the business model, depending on the size of the proposed work scope, the next steps could be different following the audit. The argument I'm going to make is that it is critical that the next steps are very, very clear, that a customer is not left hanging after the audit report and uncertain about what to do next. Ideally, I would want to, and this is going to put on my sales and marketing hat, ideally, you would want the audit to translate into a sale or a commitment to purchase as soon as possible. If that can be done right there on site at the end of the audit, by all means, that should be the target. However, if it's a $20,000 work scope and other decision makers need to be involved and there needs to be time for financing, understood, it can't always happen right at the end of the audit. My argument is that those next steps need to be as simple and as clear as possible. And I would look to the auditor and the auditing company to really help facilitate those steps, to lay them out in a way with clear phone numbers, contact information, and a clear set of next steps, and probably even some follow-up to nudge the customers along the way, stealing one of Beth's words, but to nudge the customers along the way to help them make those steps. Right. Next one. So again, similar to the choices, each additional step you ask a customer to make, there's going to be some drop off. So try to stick to the minimum number of steps to get them engaged, to get them committed, and then that's going to help you. Next. So a few high-level points that I think some of the other panelists have already touched on. The average length of report that I reviewed was 17 pages because many of them did include glossaries and quite a bit of technical information or specifications for contractor. What I would say is that from a customer's perspective and from a sales perspective, any critical information that's going to lead to a customer deciding yes or no should be captured in the first 1 to 2, maybe even 3 or 4 pages. But if a customer is given a 17-page document with an expectation that they're supposed to review all 17 of those pages as part of their decision-making process, then again, they're going to be overwhelmed, and that's going to definitely impact the decision-making process and the ability to convert. Package the first 1, 2, 3 pages with all that critical information that allows them to understand their next steps and to make that decision, and provide the other pages, because you're gonna do an audit for an engineer that wants all the backup documentation at times, or the contractor that comes out to the house is going to need the CFM50 numbers. So keep that information, but package it in a way that you prioritize the sales information at the very beginning. Next one. So just to summarize the points I brought up, which again have been echoed by some of the other panelists, make your report customer specific. Language, imagery, photos, graphs, recommendations, everything should be specific to that customer. I did include just a note that there are readability statistics available within Microsoft Word, and you can actually compare, different text, and you can play around with understanding what grade level you're writing to. So it's a fun thing to think about. But again, I think it's all based upon, can the recipient of the report clearly explain it to someone else? Then certainly prioritize the report, focus on the sales first, supporting detailed information afterwards, and then of course, give very clear next steps. Give them a chance to say yes to something, whether that's a signed contract, whether that's a pledge, as Beth was talking about, but something to get them to commit to going forward and taking that next step. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Harrison. You want to progress here? So I'm going to look at 3 different perspectives of what the requirements are for the development of an audit report and the associated software to do that. And we've been all 3 of these different roles over time. And in fact, since we've been developing tools since around 1998, and we out in the field with those since 2001, we've actually had an evolution of our own tools that we provided as well. So one of the really high level questions in this is, are you trying to mandate consistency or offer flexibility? It's really clear from the report, recommendations for personalization, that flexibility is a very good thing. But there's also all sorts of concerns depending upon who the customer is on what they want in the form of consistency. And so those different types of customers include contractor, it could be an energy auditor, or it could be a program. And when you're developing a tool, you have to decide whether you're developing it for all of these or one segment of those. Our tools have gone from being PC-based, simulation-centered tools to tools that are linked to online databases to tools that can be accessed by app stores. And so that's sort of that evolution of technology over time. Next. So as a program administrator, we really haven't had a standard of practice to share with our customers who are program administrators or program implementers. And so this report is extremely valuable. And I think it will have a major impact on getting more savings out of programs. And so that this is, ACEEE is to be congratulated for doing this. This is great stuff. Program administrator goals vary, and Harrison covered some of this. Is the goal education? Is it conversion? There are considerations around consumer protection and also liability associated with recommendations or things that you find in the building. One of the things to remember in the context of a program administrator is that, in fact, the audits themselves do not save energy. So oftentimes, they're bundled with the direct installation of low-cost measures, and that, in effect, creates the savings that pays for the audit program. And then, depending upon how the program's set up, there may also be savings that are claimed from capital measures, but sometimes those are actually in other programs. It just depends on how things are set up. And all of these are influences, obviously, on how you design the program and actually what you're doing in the building while you're there. You can also have, from the program implementer perspective, market-based programs where private companies are delivering this, and they have their own. They'd like to have their own brand out in front of the customer. They would like to, even though it's under a program, if they're acting as an independent agent, maybe they want to sell stuff. Depends upon what the model is. Or you can have program audit delivery where it's they're in effect an employee of the program or program implementer, and representing in effect the utility or program administrator in that context. And those are very different as to what types of personalization, what types of branding go with that report, and what you're trying. Are you trying to sell something in particular, or are you trying to sell things in general, etc. And we also now, over time, aligning audit report data with, we have to align that with the program data requirements and the evaluation requirements. Next. as a home performance contractor, which we were for about 10 years, the real question is, where are you making your money? Are you making your money off of selling the installations? Are you making money off of the audits? If audits are paid for, and you can make money selling audits and selling direct install measures, that may be your primary business model. Or you may be doing both, and you may be using audits in a part to screen for customers who want to make an installation. The real critical thing here is how do you establish trust without creating confusion? And this goes back to all these recommendations about too much information, etc. We want to be able to document the conditions, and that may be with test results or photos, and supply that there, but we don't want to create too much confusion with those. We want to be able to link those conditions that we find to the various recommendations. And then we have to decide how we're presenting the recommendations. Are we providing them in a long list, or are we providing them grouped into logical or levels of or packages with perhaps level of investment? So that the integration is made more clear to the customer. And again, what you're doing in the field for what has to be coordinated with what the requirements of the program are. You may have your own procedures for collecting information relative to being able to price out a job, and that may be different data than what the program may require. And I'll talk more about what's happening about aligning those things in a little bit here. And then the report presentation is a huge question here. Can I do this as a one-stop? Can I calculate and price and load the photos and present it to a person? And that's, with a two-person team, that might be possible to do. The other advantage of a two-person team is one person can focus on the actual collection of the data, and then somebody else can focus on the customer and learning more about what their concerns are and creating a stronger trust relationship. And those are oftentimes two different kinds of people. So having a two-person team lets you differentiate a little more and maybe instead of finding that magical person who has both skills, you can hire a little more easily. And then if you're not doing one-stop, you may do, you may have a follow-up visit or an email or mail, depending upon what you're doing there. Go ahead, sorry. The future of audit reports, really, I think one of the things that we're seeing emerging as a new opportunity is the idea that we help customers set goals. And that can be with the integration of scoring systems like Home Energy Score. And we can see here on the left, on the right rather, the image of what's happening where these different tools are sort of all being brought onto a common calculation base. And that's going to make it easier to generate scores at the same time that you may be doing something else. And that score gives you ongoing engagement with the customer over time, and potentially can convert what would be a single sale for an installation contractor, for example, into multiple sales over time, and a way to communicate progress towards that goal. And that aligns well, I think, with the idea of the nudges, etc. And potentially web-based or email interactions. The other thing that we're seeing is increased access to interval data. And interval data gives us a lot more information about that. Sometimes if for a customer to share that with an independent contractor, who's not necessarily someone working directly with the utility, they need a mechanism to collect and share that. And that's called Green Button Connect. So we've been creating those connections where we can access interval data and use that to help inform the analysis and provide better advice to customers. And with Green Button Connect, we can actually do that before we get to the building. And having that information before you're in that usage information before you go into the building really helps you guide and focus in on where the savings really is. And then the other increasing source of information about usage is thermostats, and we have more and more web-connected thermostats, and more thermostats being installed at time of audit. So those are sort of data-related activities that we're seeing more and more. The third trend is towards pay-for-performance audits, and so there we have less requirement from a program saying thou shalt do this, and more flexibility as to how we're going to do it. But we also carry, in the form of like just the way that a private contractor would, the cost of sales. So now we have to be very efficient with the audit, and that audit becomes a real critical. The conversion rates and the size of the transaction that's happening out of that becomes very, very important. And I think that that's going to move audits from perhaps providing more education to being more focused on directly on those recommendations that will provide the best return on investment for the P4P investor. And that's a shift from programs where we've maybe been thinking about audits as more having broader educational impacts. That may not line up that well with the pay for performance approach. We'll see where that goes. And then finally, standardization of data. The HPXML data schema and the home energy score data schema provide standardized values that give you access to other tools, and that's again what this technology stack view of is over here. We're able to collect data and send it to other sources and get it processed, and that potentially could include the development of audit reports that are generated directly from HPXML as well. So someone could create a tool that reads an HPXML file and generates a custom report. And offer that out on the web, and then a contractor could do that if they had the HPXML data. Also, standardization of data allows us to more easily access incentives and line up the data that we're collecting for installation with the data that we're collecting for program requirements. And I have a blog that I did on this for the Home Performance Coalition that's posted at hpxmlonline.org. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Greg. And thank you to all the speakers that have participated today. With their blessing, or actually without their blessing, I asked them to put their email addresses up here. So if you have more questions, you can contact them directly. I also wanted to mention again that this is the second in a series of BECC-sponsored webinars. If you're interested in the nexus between behavior, energy, and climate change, and you want to know more about how behavioral science can be used in energy efficiency, I recommend checking out this conference. The early bird rate ends in May 15th, so sign up now if you can. And again, if you wanted to get more information about the report we're talking about today, you can download the report or the fact sheet, the 2-page fact sheet, at the link that is rather difficult to read, but it's up there. We're recording this webinar will be up on YouTube in the next day or two, and you can register for BECC at the BECC website. So now, I know we're running really short on time. I'm sorry we went a little bit late, but we're going to keep the webinar going for an extra 10 minutes or so beyond the planned end time, and answer a few of your questions. So send us your questions, and Maxine will read them out, and we'll try to answer them.
Okay, so the first question we have here, can you recommend good resources can you recommend good resources, for example, of energy audit reports that meet the criteria for this report?
So the question, with regards to sample energy reports that are good, you can check our fact sheet that kind of describes some of the better reports. Also, one of the top reports that we looked at was by a group called Envinity, E-N-V-I-N-I-T-Y, and that report is available online. So you can take a look at that one, which was quite good. I believe actually the Vermont NeighborWorks Heat Squad report might also be available online. Those are two pretty good examples. None of the examples are perfect, but those ones will get you part of the way, most of the way, I would say.
And Ruben, if I can just say one quick thing, just from like kind of a behavioral science perspective, our goal is not to find a recipe for a perfect report. It's to, from my perspective at least, is to keep a lot of these things in mind, that there are these best practices that you can think about incorporating in your report. The best report is not going to be following a recipe. It's going to be really understanding what things need to be highlighted and improving them over time. You know, if we look at things like Facebook, it's always changing, you know, so think about how can we continue to optimize based on what we're learning over time. And yes, there are best practices in this report that Reuven put together, gives so many of them, and just keep questioning, keep kind of rethinking instead of looking for the perfect example.
Yeah, that's a good point. There is no perfect example, and you can't simply put your results into a template and get it right. It's about customization, personalization, and each situation is different. Your creativity is important. Next question.
All right, another question. Are PAs taking this information to heart? How does the community ensure this for more success with energy efficiency initiatives?
Program administrators. Well, given that the report was just released last week, our hope was to try to get this report as well as this webinar into the hands and ears of the program administrators and others that can actually use this. Greg, do you have any comment on who might use this and whether it will be used?
I think you know, people have already expressed interest in it to me, and you know, I think it's setting a standard of practice. And so even though it may not be a prescription, that, you know, people are going to start looking at reports using this as a way to value them. You know, so I think it's going to have a pretty rapid impact on things, to be honest.
Yeah, when we were at HPC last week, the Home Performance Coalition conference, there did seem to be substantial amount of interest from various parties. So we do hope that this will have an impact going forward. We've also consulted personally with a few organization program implementers that have audit programs, and we're meeting with a few of them in person to go over, not in person, but personally, to go over some of their reports to see how they can be improved.
Yeah, competition is a strong force.
Next question.
So a common question here. Many of the 6 high-level findings that were in Reuven's presentation involved a lot on deep personalization and hands-on time with the client. Even if this improves the report, does it not add cost and time to the process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an important piece. This particular report was focused more on the customer experience and the likelihood of creating a customer conversion or follow-through. We were less interested in the time and effort that it would take, but we do recognize that more time and effort leads to a higher likelihood of a response. So our goal is to increase responses. In a way, we're suggesting that people spend more time on these reports. Now, with the kind of advances that Greg is creating with the software, it's our hope that a lot of the more difficult things that assessors might not be experts with, like designing, like creating good design, could be taken out of their hands and automated. But yeah, in a way, one of the underlying recommendations is we need to spend more time on these audits and thinking about them as sales tools, as Harrison pointed out.
And this is Beth. I would just say, I mean, audits in general are one of the higher, if not highest touch approaches to energy efficiency. And I think it's key to not add to that burden, but leverage the fact that audits are personal and there is an opportunity to be a little more customized and personalized than a traditional home energy report. And they weren't all necessarily optimizing the time that already is being taken in an audit environment over other forms of communication. So rather than, yes, some of these might add time, but really the focus first is to leverage the fact that this is already a high time investment in terms of an energy efficiency engagement and how to optimize for that.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
You know, it's really the constraints of the budget for the particular interaction are going to, you know, be primary, but the nature of the information is such that it could be applied to any level of effort. So I think it's going to be helpful.
Next question.
Greg, I think this might be directed to you. Are there any existing report generating tools for a smaller utility to access rather than building their own to create a good report?
Well, I mean, there are plenty of energy audit tools out there. And in fact, what I'm suggesting is, and this is part of what I cover in the blog post, is in some ways the potential for separation of data collection from report generation. And that's at this point just a potential. It hasn't happened yet, but it certainly could happen, where processing of information from different sources, as long as that information is in a common framework such as HPXML or the HES XML, that could be used to instead of doing calculations, could be used to put that information into a report that would be customized, or etc.
So part of the reason that we created this report on how to design and create assessment reports is that we recognize that a lot of smaller organizations can't afford the software or the highest top of the line software, and they're just doing their own designs, and they're creating things in PowerPoint slides or Word templates. For those people, I believe that some of the insights that are in this report could be helpful. And for people that can afford the software, that's great as well. There's still some customization that would occur even within the template. So it looks like everybody's asked their questions. Thank you very much for attending today. If you have any further questions, please contact myself or any of the other panelists. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much, and we'll talk later.